Inside what was once the billiard room of a requisitioned country house, a man in shirt sleeves leans over a long wooden table. Spread out in front of him on brown paper are the skins of dead rats, collected over the past fortnight from a biological supplier in London who believes they are destined for laboratory dissection. Beside him sits a tin of gray, faintly oily putty. It smells of marzipan and machine oil at once. He pinches off a piece, kneads it between his fingers until it softens like clay, and begins to pack it carefully into the hollowed-out body of the nearest carcass. Through the wall, somewhere out on the estate's old croquet lawn, something detonates. Nobody in the room looks up. At Aston House, explosions are simply part of the working day. The man finishes packing the rat, tucks a small detonator into the cavity, and begins to stitch the skin closed with surgical thread, working the loose fur back into place until the thing on the table looks, once again, like nothing more than an ordinary dead rat. Which is, of course, the entire point. This is the explosive rat, one of the strangest devices to emerge from Britain's secret war, and in some ways one of the most revealing. It was designed not to look like a weapon at all, but to look like nothing whatsoever, to be the kind of small, unremarkable, slightly repulsive object that a tired man on a night shift would deal with without a second thought. No agent would need to plant it. No safe would need to be cracked. No sentry talked past. Somebody else would do the work without ever knowing they had done anything at all. And here's the strange part of the story, the part that makes it worth telling. When this device finally had its moment, it never exploded. Not once. By the Special Operations Executive's own later assessment, it did more damage to the German war effort that way than it ever could have done if it had worked exactly as planned. A weapon that succeeded by failing. That paradox and the small band of engineers, chemists, and former criminals who built the thing is where this story begins. By the autumn of 1941, Britain had been at war for 2 years, much of that time alone, and Winston Churchill had given the newly formed Special Operations Executive an instruction that was as simple as it was nearly impossible. Set Europe ablaze. Somewhere out there, across the Channel, lay the factories, power stations, shipyards, and railway yards that kept the German war machine fed with steel, coal, and rolling stock. Britain could not yet reach most of them with bombers in any meaningful way, and even where the Royal Air Force could reach, hardened industrial buildings absorbed extraordinary tonnages of bombs for relatively modest results. So the task fell to sabotage, to small numbers of agents and resistance fighters working inside occupied territory against targets that were, by their nature, heavily protected. A factory boiler house was not some isolated country lane where a charge could be laid in darkness and left to do its work. It sat inside a perimeter fence, often guarded, always staffed with workers coming and going around the clock. An agent carrying even a modest quantity of plastic explosive risked discovery at any checkpoint between the drop zone and the target. And discovery rarely ended in anything as simple as confiscation. It generally ended in interrogation, and often in the arrest or execution of everyone connected to the operation, sometimes including civilians who had nothing to do with it. Conventional sabotage, in other words, required an agent to get dangerous material past multiple layers of searching, hold their nerve at every checkpoint, find the target, place the charge, arm it, and escape, all without being seen, in a country where a foreign accent or a missing identity card could be fatal. Multiply that by the scale of what needed disrupting across occupied Europe, and the numbers simply did not work. SOE had, by this point, only a handful of working networks on the continent, a fraction of the nearly 90 that would eventually exist in France alone by the war's end, and an even smaller fraction of the trained agents who could be risked on any single operation. There was also the question of what happened afterwards. Occupying authorities across Europe had already shown, time and again, that the response to sabotage was rarely limited to the saboteur. Reprisals against entire workforces, sometimes entire villages, were a real and constant risk, and SOE's planners in London were acutely aware that every operation they sanctioned carried consequences that would fall on people who had never been asked whether they wanted to take part. A method that left no trace of foreign involvement at all, that looked to every investigator who examined it afterwards like nothing more than rotten luck, was not just operationally convenient. It was, in its own way, the safer option for everyone except the enemy. What SOE's planners began to ask, through 1941, was a different kind of question. Instead of, how do we get an agent and a bomb past the guards, what if the bomb did not need an agent at all? What if it could be delivered by someone on the inside who had no idea they were delivering anything? Someone simply doing their job, disposing of rubbish exactly as they did every single day. Every factory, every locomotive shed, every power station had a boiler room, and every boiler room had a stoker whose job was to shovel fuel into a firebox without thinking too hard about what, precisely, was being shoveled. If the weapon could disguise itself as something that belonged in that rubbish, something the stoker would want to get rid of rather than investigate, then the enemy would, in effect, plant the bomb himself. That brief landed on the desks of a very particular group of people at Aston House near Stevenage in Hertfordshire. Officially Station 12 of the Special Operations Executive, the organization's principal research and development center for explosives and what the files dryly called special devices. It operated under a strange kind of double life, a 17th-century manor house with a croquet lawn and a walled garden, staffed by chemists, engineers, locksmiths, and, by some accounts, at least one or two former safe-breakers recruited for their professional insight into how things could be hidden, opened, or destroyed without anyone noticing. At the center of much of this work was Major Cecil Vanderpeer Clark, known to almost everyone as Nobby, an engineer who had already spent years designing demolition charges, time fuses, and the strange spigot mortars used to train the Czechoslovak agents who would go on to carry out the assassination of the senior SS officer Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. Clark's particular talent was not raw destructive power — Aston House had plenty of people who could make things explode — but concealment. By 1941, the station's catalog of disguised explosive devices already ran to an extraordinary list. Charges hidden inside lumps of coal, bars of soap, hollowed-out logs, tins of food, bicycle pumps, and bottles of wine. The guiding philosophy was always the same. Sabotage worked best when it did not look like sabotage at all, when a boiler explosion looked like a boiler explosion, an industrial accident looked like an industrial accident, and nobody went looking for saboteurs in the first place. The explosive rat took that philosophy to its logical, slightly macabre conclusion. Around 100 dead rats were obtained. Officially, the paperwork described them as required for medical research, which raised no eyebrows at a time when animal experimentation was routine and unremarkable. At Aston House, each carcass was skinned and hollowed out, then packed with a measured quantity of plastic explosive, the same malleable, putty-like compound issued in far larger lumps to agents across occupied Europe for conventional demolition work, kneaded until it had the texture of stiff dough. A small detonator was set into the charge, and in some accounts a short delay fuse as well, before the skin was carefully stitched back over the cavity and the fur smoothed down so that the finished object was, to the eye, indistinguishable from any other dead rat that might be found near a coal store. The quantity of explosive each rat could hold was small, by most accounts no more than a few hundred grams, roughly the size and weight of a bar of household soap. On its own, in open air, that amount would do little more than make a loud bang. But the rat was never meant to detonate in open air. It was meant to go into a firebox, inside a working boiler holding steam under enormous pressure. Not unlike a pressure cooker, but scaled up to the size of a small room. Rupture that vessel from the inside, even with a relatively small charge, and the released steam and pressure could tear the boiler apart entirely, in the same way that a tiny puncture in an overinflated tire produces a bang vastly out of proportion to the size of the hole. The rat did not need to be powerful. It needed only to be in the right place when the stoker's shovel went to work. Once assembled, the devices were packed for shipment. The surviving records suggest a batch of around 100, though exactly how many were finished and how many actually left Britain is one of the details that has not survived in any detail. The plan was for them to be distributed via SOE's contacts on the continent, near coal stores and fuel dumps at factories, power stations, and locomotive depots in occupied Belgium, where an unsuspecting worker clearing away what looked like vermin would do the rest. If you're finding this as strange and fascinating as I do, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think. It tells the channel to keep digging through archives like this one. What happened next is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to pin down, and it is worth being honest about that difficulty rather than pretending otherwise. The first shipment of rats, crossing into occupied territory sometime in late 1941, was intercepted by German security services before it ever reached its intended targets. Exactly where and exactly how, SOE's own files do not say with any precision. What is documented is the German reaction, and it tells you almost everything about why this device mattered despite never working as intended. Rather than quietly disposing of the find, German technical personnel recognized it for what it was and treated it as a serious threat. Specimens were put on display at military and technical training establishments across occupied Europe, as an example of British ingenuity for engineers and stokers to be wary of. Searches were ordered at factories, depots, and fuel stores for further exploding rats. For weeks afterwards, by SOE's own account, German personnel at industrial sites across the region were, quite literally, afraid of finding dead vermin near their boilers. One later biography of a Station 12 officer claimed that the rats went on to destroy 9 boilers in factories across Belgium. Most historians treat this as almost certainly a myth. SOE's contemporary assessment was built entirely around the interception and its aftermath, not around any successful detonation, and no documented case of a rat actually reaching a firebox has ever come to light. The honest version of this story does not need that embellishment. SOE's own verdict, recorded after the war, was that the trouble and anxiety the discovery caused the Germans amounted to a far greater success than the rats achieving their original purpose ever could have. It is worth pausing on how unusual that verdict is. Most weapons are judged on what they destroy. The explosive rat is one of the rare cases in the entire war where a British intelligence organization looked at a device that had completely failed in its primary function and concluded, on reflection, that this was the best possible outcome. Britain was not alone in thinking this way, though the explosive rat itself appears to have had no direct equivalent on either side. German sabotage units, operating through the Abwehr's own sabotage branch, ran a comparable program of disguised charges aimed at Allied shipping and infrastructure, explosive lumps of coal among them, an idea that had actually first appeared decades earlier during the American Civil War and had clearly occurred independently to more than one set of military engineers since. German agents landed in the United States in 1942 carrying their own demolition kits disguised among ordinary traveling supplies, and German technical manuals of the period describe a range of camouflaged charges for use against railways and docks. But the German catalog, by most accounts, stayed closer to conventional camouflage: coal, timber, cargo, the everyday objects of an industrial supply chain. Turning a dead animal into a weapon does not appear to have occurred to them, or, if it did, no record of it has surfaced. Across the Atlantic, the American equivalent of Aston House was the research division of the Office of Strategic Services, run by a Boston chemist named Stanley Lovell, who startled General Donovan on their first meeting by introducing himself as, in effect, America's answer to a fictional master criminal. Lovell's division produced its own remarkable catalog of disguised explosives, among them a compound named Aunt Jemima, designed to look and behave exactly like ordinary pancake flour and capable of being baked into bread by an unwitting cook, and incendiary devices disguised as animal droppings for use against vehicles in North Africa and the Far East. The American program, founded later than its British counterpart and developed in close liaison with it through the British Security Coordination Office in New York, was in many ways built on foundations that Aston House and its sister stations had already laid, and the two organizations regularly exchanged designs and ideas as the war went on. Was the British version better? On sheer scale and eccentricity, the Aston House and Fryth catalogues, running between them to several hundred disguised devices hidden inside everything from books and soap to bicycle pumps and wine bottles, were arguably the most extensive of any combatant nations. But better is the wrong measure for something like the explosive rat. It was not a more efficient bomb. It was a stranger idea, arrived at by a small group of British engineers who had been given an apparently impossible brief and decided, not entirely seriously at first, that the answer might be to weaponize something nobody would ever want to pick up. In material terms, the explosive rat's legacy is essentially nothing. No factory was destroyed by one, no train derailed, no power station darkened. At least, not according to any account that has survived serious historical scrutiny. And yet its psychological legacy, modest as it sounds, was real and documented. Weeks of disrupted searches, genuine alarm among technical staff at industrial sites, and a story that German officers were apparently still telling each other years later. In a small way, it sits within a much larger pattern that ran through Britain's wartime intelligence and deception efforts. The idea that making an enemy waste time, resources, and nerves chasing a threat could be just as valuable as the threat itself, an approach that would be used on a vastly larger scale in the deception operations that helped protect the Normandy landings less than 3 years later. The explosive rat was a tiny, almost accidental preview of that principle, arrived at not through grand strategic planning but through a workshop full of people willing to ask genuinely odd questions. The wider culture of Aston House and its sister station at the Fryth, disguise, concealment, gadgets built by engineers who treated sabotage as a kind of dark hobby, also fed more loosely into the popular image of British intelligence that would emerge after the war, the world of secret workshops and impossible gadgets that Ian Fleming, who had his own wartime intelligence connections, would later draw on for his fiction. No museum is known to hold one of the original explosive rats themselves. If any survived the war, none has been definitively identified since. But other devices from the same workshops and the wartime footage of Aston House's work survive today in the Imperial War Museum's collections. A quieter, more conventional record of an extraordinarily unconventional place. Picture that workbench again, in the old billiard room at Aston House, late in 1941. A man finishes stitching a dead rat closed, sets it down with the others, and moves on to the next one. He has no way of knowing, that morning, whether any of these strange little parcels will ever do what they were built to do. As it turns out, none of them will. Not in the way he intended. And yet, somewhere in occupied Belgium, a crate is opened by men who were never meant to see what was inside it. They recognize it immediately for what it is, and that recognition alone is enough. Specimens go on display. Orders go out. Search parties move through factories and depots, checking coal stores, eyeing every dead rodent with sudden suspicion. None of it makes a sound. None of it appears in any newspaper. But for weeks, somewhere behind the lines, a small number of German technical officers cannot look at a boiler room the same way again. Britain spent the autumn of 1941 building 100 small, grotesque, carefully engineered objects designed to destroy boilers from the inside. Not one of them ever did, and by the reckoning of the people who built them, that was the best result they could have hoped for. A weapon that never fired a shot. A bomb that never went off. And, by SOE's own quiet verdict, a job done all the same. Sometimes the most effective weapon Britain ever built was simply the idea that it might exist.